Warning: this program contains disturbing real-world crimes and human remains. It is not a dramatization. What follows is the documented investigation into a man whose house became a repository of other people's bodies. This is not fiction. This is the chilling true story of the man whose home became a house of human remains. Edward Theodor Gein. Few cases in American crime history landed so abruptly, so grotesquely in the public imagination. But the facts begin not with horror itself, but with a family, a farmhouse, and a mother whose voice never left her son. Edward Gein was born into a German-American household where the language of fear and sin was spoken more clearly than words of affection. His father, George, worked the land, and his mother, Augusta G., became the center of the family in a way that would shadow the rest of Edward's life. Augusta's version of religion was strict, punitive, and dominated by the idea that the world outside their farm was full of corrupting forces. She warned her children, and her son in particular, about the dangers of women, of temptation, of the town's moral decay. In her mind, purity meant separation. In practice, it meant cutting her son off from normal social life. Harry, Edward's older brother, left home for a time and returned wounded by life and then by a suspicious fire. The father died after struggles with alcohol. Augusta became increasingly frail, then dependent, then obsessed with sin and punishment. Edward stayed. He listened. He learned to live inside the house and inside the commands of a single voice. The farm became less a home than a stage on which a severe moral script was relentlessly performed. Isolation was not merely geographic, it was a daily curriculum. Neighbors later described Augusta's admonitions and her insistence that Edward avoid the company of women. The result was a man who never learned the ordinary ways of relating, social rituals, courting, even the casual commerce of conversation. He took comfort instead in the routines of the land. Small repairs, hunting, cutting wood. He learned to keep to himself. He learned to obey. But isolation alone does not explain what came next. The story turns at moments of loss. The father's death was the first rupture. Then came Harry's disappearance in a fire that left questions unanswered. Finally, Augusta suffered a stroke and then died. With each loss, Edward's world narrowed. The person to whom he had devoted himself, whose voice had shaped his judgments, was gone. The farm, once a place of admonition, became an empty stage. Where there had been a mother who warned against the world, there was now a silence that demanded answers. What happened in the silence is the crux of the case. In small towns, absences become rumors, and rumors demand explanations. Women went missing.
Among those named in official records was Mary Hogan, sometimes recorded as Mary Hoven, a local woman who disappeared years before any arrest would be made. Her case remained unresolved. A file in the county's drawer. People asked questions. They spoke quietly at the general store, at church, at the diner. Edward's oddness was noticed. He was not menacing in a public sense. He was merely awkward, quiet, and strangely uninterested in the ordinary rhythms of social life. Yet those small alarms, taken together over time, would form a pattern. Before we move deeper, a brief word. If you follow careful, factual, true crime work, consider subscribing for more detailed histories. Stay with this account. The sequence of events that follows is methodical, and it was a sheriff's persistence that ultimately turned rumor into revelation. The disappearance that forced action in the community involved a woman named Bernice Warden. She ran the local hardware store. Her shop was a daily point of contact for neighbors and a modest business in a modest town. When she did not return from business one day, concern sharpened into a search. Frank Warden, her son, and an assistant to law enforcement found something inside the store that pulled investigators into the world of evidence. A ledger, a receipt, and then traces that could not be ignored. A smear of blood leading away from the scene. The trail was small, almost trivial, a stain on a floor and on a board, but it led outward, toward the edges of town, toward a house whose silhouette people had long associated with eccentric loneliness. Sheriff Art Shell, sometimes recorded as Art Shelley, received the call. In quiet rural law enforcement, the sheriff's lantern is often the first line between rumor and the truth. He went to the property to follow the trace. The trail of blood, sparse as it was, wound to a back road and then to the Gein farm. That simple forensic breadcrumb, a few drops on a path, a smear at a threshold, was enough to compel the sheriff to knock on the farmhouse door and to insist on access to an investigation that would not be normal, that would not be neat, and that would not allow the sheriff to remain untouched by what he found. The entry into Edward Gein's life took place on a day ordinary in the calendar, but extraordinary for those who would step across his threshold. The sheriff and his deputies moved through a property that, from the outside, looked like any other rural home. Inside, they found a scene that shattered expectations and turned every assumption about privacy and domesticity on its head. The details, as recorded by officers and later recounted in investigation reports, were not described for horror's sake, but as facts of an inquiry. What investigators documented was a house arranged not as a collection of sentimental keepsakes, but as a nervous system of objects made from human remains.
Items were found that should never belong in a home. Masks made from skin, chairs with upholstery that turned out to be something like human flesh, lampshades fashioned of a similar material, small domestic objects formed from bone and tissue. There were jars containing unidentified fragments, crania used as decoration in ways that turned the ordinary into the grotesque. A heart was mentioned among the finds, and later testimony recorded that some human remains had been burned in a stove. There are phrases investigators used to categorize these items: mobiliary fabricated with human parts, domestic fixtures crafted from flesh, clinical terms chosen to avoid lurid speculation. Officials took photographs, they cataloged, they moved carefully to preserve evidence and to respect the dignity of the victims, while also acknowledging the shock of the scene. The narrative that followed centered not on the sensational, but on the human cost. The names of the missing, the agonized families who had spent years searching for answers, and the lawmen whose duty required them to peer where most of us would not. Sheriff Art Shell's reaction was recorded in reports and in later interviews. He was a man hardened by small-town ordeals, but he was not immune to the physical effect of seeing what lay inside. He became nauseated. He stumbled in a way that showed the limits of exposure to human cruelty. At one point, overwhelmed by both revulsion and the weight of moral outrage, the sheriff lost control in a way unusual for a man of his office. Accounts say he struck Gein, banging the suspect's head against a wall in a moment of fury. That response, violent, human, regrettable to some and understandable to others, is a reminder that even those trained to face cruelty are not exempt from its corrosive effects. Gein did not simply deny. He spoke in matter-of-fact ways about long habits that had escalated into crime. He admitted to exhuming corpses from local graveyards. He confessed to making objects from what he took. He spoke of creating clothing and masks. He spoke of a compulsion that drew him back to the dead, a fixation on skin and form that he could not explain to the investigators who recorded his words. His confessions were used in court and in psychiatric evaluations, but they are not a window into motive so much as a report of behaviors. For the legal system, the question was not only what he had done, but whether he could be held criminally responsible in the usual manner. The arrest and the interrogation were not quick episodes, but parts of a prolonged legal and psychiatric process. In 1957, Gein was arrested and charged. The county and the state moved through the machinery of care and punishment available at the time. Psychiatrists evaluated him, looking for signs of psychosis, of detachment from reality, of dangerousness. Their conclusion: Gein was legally insane.
That legal determination moved the case out of the ordinary criminal calendar and into the mental institution system. He spent decades confined, under observation and under care in state facilities, until his death in 1984. The legal language, not guilty by reason of insanity or legally insane, does not erase the harm done to the victims or to their families. It does not make the images in the sheriff's report any less real. What it does do is place the case in a medical and legal context that accepts, at least provisionally, that there are instances in which a person's inner life becomes so fractured that ordinary responsibility cannot be applied. That conclusion sat uneasily with the public. People wanted simple justice, a trial, a sentence. Instead, they received an institutionalization and a story that would, over time, feed a peculiar kind of cultural appetite. Because the case is both singular and symbolic, it seeped into American culture in ways that the law could not control. Filmmakers, writers, and the press found in Gein's life raw material for horror. Elements of the case inspired Norman Bates's Motel and disturbed psychology in Psycho. They infused the grotesque domesticity of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Traces can be seen in characters like Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. These creative works did not and cannot reproduce the legal facts. They adapted emotions and images, the violating intimacy of a killer who domesticates death, the perverse return of the dead into a living home. This cultural response raises ethical questions that persist decades later.
How does society remember victims when the image of the killer becomes a profitable commodity? How do we avoid transforming a documented crime into a franchise, into merchandise, into a tourist attraction? In the years after the arrest, people sought the Gein house, photographs, relics. Souvenir culture met grief. T-shirts, pulp books, and exploitation films turned a sheriff's report into product. The families of Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan watched as the names of their lost relatives were supplanted in the public mind by a lurid figure with a nickname and a mask. When discussing the victims, it is essential to restore their names and their humanity. Bernice Worden ran a hardware store, interacted daily with neighbors, and was known to her community in concrete ways. Mary Hogan's disappearance remained an open wound among families who deserved closure. These were people with routines and relationships and futures taken from them. No amount of cultural retelling should obscure that fact or allow the sensational aspects of the case to eclipse the quiet loss their families suffered. It is also important to look at the institutional side of what happened. The sheriff and his deputies did what their duty required. They followed evidence, rescued remains, documented crime scenes, and attempted to bring resolution where there had been none.
The legal outcome and the psychiatric evaluations that led to institutionalization illustrate how the criminal justice system sometimes defers to medical judgment when behavior appears rooted in severe mental disturbance. That deferral does not make the case simpler. It complicates questions of accountability, of public safety, and of how best to care for people who commit monstrous acts, yet may be clinically ill. At the same time, analysts caution against a reductive narrative that attributes everything to bad genes or madness. Augusta G's dominant presence and the family's isolation are factors to consider, not deterministic explanations. Social withdrawal, religious extremism, and traumatic losses create conditions in which pathology can develop, but they do not predetermine a particular outcome. The story of Edward Gein forces uncomfortable reflections on parenting that crushes social development, on communities that stigmatize and thereby isolate, and on the ways grief can become fixation when it is not processed. The discovery of human remains in a domestic setting challenged loving categories, the home as sanctuary, the household as refuge. The house that should have been a place of quilts and family photos operated instead as a shrine to death. That inversion haunted the public imagination because it drew a direct line between private life and public horror. It asked a question that communities rarely hear. What is done, quietly, behind closed doors, that the rest of us cannot see? Reporters and storytellers grappled with that question in different ways. Some covered the facts with sobriety, prioritizing victims and legal outcomes. Others were less restrained. Newspapers printed sensational headlines. Popular culture mined the details for shock value. That mix of coverage helped entrench a cultural image of Gein as a prototype of the monstrous serial killer, a figure more mythic than real. Yet the myth obscures everyday truths. In the wake of the case, local authorities tightened procedures for missing persons and for grave protection. The public conversation shifted, slowly, toward questions of mental health services and social support. Shrinking resources and dismissive attitudes toward rural suffering were exposed as structural problems that might, in other contexts, allow pathology to fester unnoticed. Edward Gein's institutional life after his arrest and medical adjudication was long. He spent years under psychiatric care, periodically evaluated and sometimes transferred between facilities. The aim of confinement was ostensibly therapeutic and protective, intended to prevent further harm while attempting to treat the underlying disturbance. He died in 1984, after decades of living under state custody. For the families of his victims, the arrival at that endpoint did not bring much solace. Legal closure is not the same as consolation for loss.
There remains, too, the memory of how law enforcement experienced this case. Sheriff Art Shell's loss of composure, his nausea, and his violent outburst are not details to be judged only by strict standards of procedure. They are human responses. They also speak to the inadequacy of preparation. Police officers and sheriffs are trained to process crime scenes and to manage evidence, but there is a limit to the capacity for exposure to human cruelty without institutional support for those who bear witness. Today, conversations about the mental health of first responders draw attention to exactly these kinds of reactions, arguing that people who serve the public in this capacity need structured care after traumatic exposure. The ethical dilemma of the public appetite for monsters also deserves frank attention. When true crimes are packaged as entertainment, the risk is twofold. First, the victims and their families may be re-traumatized by the constant retelling. Second, the killers can become icons, with their actions romanticized or fetishized. This is not a new observation, but the Gein case exemplifies it. What began as a local tragedy became, through media and art, an enduring cultural touchstone for horror. Those who tell such stories carry a responsibility to report facts with restraint, to avoid salacious detail, and to insist, when possible, on the humanity of those who were harmed. There is a particular moral urgency in remembering the names of the victims and the small human details of their lives. Bernice Worden was more than the subject of a blood trail. Mary Hogan was more than a file marked missing. Families lost routines, a handshake at the hardware store, a neighbor's laugh on a Sunday, a mother's steady presence. Restoring those images helps counterbalance the more sensational narratives that have eclipsed them. Finally, we should consider what the Gein case asks of us as a society. It asks whether we can create communities that notice and intervene before pathology becomes catastrophe. It asks whether we can balance public curiosity with respect. It asks whether the law, the mental health system, and community care can work together to prevent future tragedies. There are no simple answers. The case forces us into uncomfortable territory, where compassion, accountability, and prevention must be discussed without resort to scapegoating or oversimplification. The story of Edward Theodor Gein is in its recorded facts an account of horror in domestic form. It is also an archival lesson in how families, communities, law enforcement, and culture respond to violence. The images that come to mind when we say his name are disturbing, but the true cost is measured in the people he harmed and the ripple effects through a county and a culture. It is measured also in the sheriff who could not look away without becoming sick, and in the families who continue to live with absence.
As this account closes, remember the victims rather than the spectacle. Remember Bernice Worden, remember Mary Hogan, and remember the quiet lives backlit by tragedy. The job of telling such stories is not entertainment. It is a form of witness. We bear witness to make sure facts are not lost to sensationalism, to insist that human lives remain at the center of any narrative about violence. If this story matters to you, please consider watching our other deep dives into cases that shaped criminal justice and culture. Share this episode with someone who should know the full context, and subscribe to follow more careful, respectful examinations of true crime history.